"Can I buy that dog, Daddy?" 8-year-old Emma Anderson whispered, her small hand tugging at Officer Michael Anderson's uniform sleeve. He looked down at the German shepherd chained to a rusted post, then froze mid-breath when those amber eyes met his, intelligent, haunted, and unmistakably familiar. This wasn't just any abandoned dog. The homeless veteran holding the cardboard sign stumbled backward, his weathered face draining of color. "Jesus Christ," Harold muttered, the $5 for the beast sign slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering to the sidewalk. Emma's grip tightened on her father's hand, her voice barely audible above the summer traffic. "Daddy, why does he look like he's been waiting for us?" The question hit Michael like a punch to the chest, the same words his own father had whispered about their family dog 30 years ago, the night before he disappeared forever. "We need to go, now," Michael commanded, but his feet wouldn't move. Who was this dog, and why did those eyes hold the same secrets his father had taken to his grave? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The coastal town of Millbrook, California, basked under the late August sun, its Victorian houses painted in pastels that reminded visitors of Easter eggs arranged along the hillside. Salt air mixed with the scent of blooming jasmine as tourists wandered the cobblestone streets, cameras clicking at every weathered fishing boat bobbing in the harbor. For most residents, it was paradise. For Officer Michael Anderson, it was a gilded cage holding too many secrets. Michael had returned to his hometown 3 years ago after his divorce, carrying his 8-year-old daughter Emma and a duffel bag of regrets. At 42, his brown hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his gray eyes held the weight of a man who'd seen too much. The Millbrook Police Department was small, just 12 officers serving a population that swelled from 8,000 to 20,000 during tourist season. It was supposed to be quiet work, the kind where the biggest crimes involved drunk college kids or parking violations. It was supposed to help him forget. Emma Anderson was sunshine incarnate, despite losing her mother to a car accident when she was 3. Her blonde hair caught light like spun gold, and her green eyes sparkled with the kind of innocence that made hardened cops stop mid-sentence to wave at her through patrol car windows. She lived for the stories her late grandmother used to tell about faithful dogs who saved their families, tales that had planted seeds of longing in her young heart. Since moving to Millbrook, she'd asked for a dog approximately once per week, with the persistence of ocean waves wearing down stone. Michael's father, Thomas Anderson, had been Millbrook's police chief 30 years ago before vanishing without explanation when Michael was 10. The official story was a heart attack during a fishing trip, body never recovered. But Michael remembered the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, the way his mother's face would tighten whenever someone mentioned his father's import business on the side. After his mother's death 5 years ago, Michael had inherited a house full of locked rooms and unanswered questions. Now, standing on Pine Street with the summer heat pressing against his uniform, Michael felt the weight of 3 decades of buried mysteries. The German shepherd at his feet was magnificent despite his scars, easily 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence, with a coat that shifted from black to silver in the sunlight. Deep grooves circled his neck where a chain had worn away the fur, and his right ear bore a distinctive notch that looked deliberate, like a cattle brand. Harold Brewster, the homeless veteran clutching the cardboard sign, kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. His army jacket hung loose on his thin frame, and his hands shook with more than just withdrawal tremors. He'd appeared in Millbrook 2 weeks ago, camping behind the old cannery with a dog that never barked, never played, just watched everything with those unnervingly intelligent amber eyes. "Mister," Harold said, his voice cracking like old leather, "you don't want this animal. Trust me on that." But Emma had already dropped to her knees, her small hand extended toward the scarred shepherd, and Michael felt the first tremor of recognition shake his carefully constructed world. The $5 bill felt like lead in Michael's hand as he stared down at Harold Brewster. The homeless veteran's eyes darted between Michael's badge and the German shepherd, sweat beading on his forehead despite the coastal breeze. Something was wrong, had been wrong since the moment those amber eyes locked onto his. "Why are you selling him?" Michael asked, his cop instincts finally overriding his father's confusion. The question hung in the salt air like a challenge. Harold's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Can't keep him no more. Traveling light, you understand." His words came too fast, rehearsed. "Found him abandoned up near the old quarry road. Been trying to find him a good home." Emma's small fingers were already stroking the shepherd's scarred muzzle, and the dog's entire demeanor shifted. The rigid alertness melted into something gentler, though his eyes never left Michael's face. It was unsettling, like being recognized by someone you couldn't quite place. "What's his name?" Emma asked, looking up at Harold with the trusting expression that had gotten her into trouble more times than Michael could count. "Didn't give him one," Harold muttered, but his voice cracked on the lie. "Just called him Dog." Michael crouched beside his daughter, studying the animal more closely. The scars told a story, not of random abuse, but of systematic training. The notched ear wasn't from a fight, it was too clean, too precise, a brand of ownership. And those paws were massive, built for power and endurance, like the police K9s he'd worked with in Sacramento. "He knows commands," Emma said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder. She'd raised her small hand in what Michael recognized as the stop signal, and the dog had immediately sat, spine straight, eyes alert. "Look, Daddy, he's been trained." Harold took a step backward, his army surplus boots scraping against the sidewalk. "Look, officer, you want him or not? I got places to be." But his eyes kept scanning the street as if expecting someone to emerge from the gathering shadows. Michael pulled out his wallet, his fingers hesitating over the bills. Every instinct he'd developed in 15 years of police work was screaming that this was wrong. Dogs like this didn't end up chained to posts for $5. Dogs like this belonged to someone important, someone who would come looking. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Please, he needs us." The shepherd turned his head at the sound of her voice, and Michael saw something that made his chest tighten. Recognition, not just of Emma, but of the moment itself. As if the dog had been waiting for exactly this conversation, this choice, this family. $5, Michael said, extending the bill toward Harold. The veteran snatched the money so quickly his fingers brushed Michael's palm, and Michael felt the tremor in the man's hands. "Good luck," Harold whispered, but it sounded more like a warning than a blessing. He turned and hurried away, his military-issue duffel bag bouncing against his hip as he disappeared around the corner toward the harbor. Emma was already untying the rope from the shepherd's collar, her small fingers working at the knots with determination. "What should we call him?" she asked, looking up at Michael with eyes that reminded him painfully of his late wife. Michael studied the dog's noble bearing, the way he held himself like a soldier at attention even while sitting. "How about Ranger?" he suggested, remembering the stories his father used to tell about military dogs who served with honor. Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Ranger?" she repeated, and the dog's ears pricked forward at the sound of his new name. "I think he likes it." But as they walked toward Michael's patrol car, Ranger kept glancing back toward the harbor where Harold had vanished, and Michael caught himself doing the same. The evening fog was rolling in from the Pacific, turning the familiar streets of Millbrook into something mysterious and potentially dangerous. "Daddy," Emma said as they reached the car, "why was that man so scared?" Michael looked down at his daughter, Then at the German Shepherd, who had already positioned himself between Emma and the street. Instincts intact despite whatever trauma had carved those scars into his hide. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think we're going to find out." As he opened the car door, Michael's radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a break-in reported at 12047 Harbor Road. Suspect fled on foot toward downtown. Be advised, K-9 unit may be involved." Michael's blood ran cold. Harbor Road was less than 3 blocks from where they'd found Harold and Ranger, and in 15 years of police work, he'd never heard dispatch mention a K-9 unit in connection with a simple break-in. Unless the dog wasn't simple at all. The radio call sent ice through Michael's veins, but he kept his voice steady as he responded. "Unit 7 responding to Harbor Road break-in, ETA 3 minutes. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Emma, who was already chattering to Ranger about their house, their yard, all the adventures they would have together. The German Shepherd sat perfectly still in the back seat, but his amber eyes were fixed on Michael's reflection in the mirror with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The house at 1247 Harbor Road belonged to Martha Campbell, an 82-year-old widow who had lived in Millbrook longer than anyone could remember. Her Victorian cottage sat perched on the bluff overlooking the harbor, surrounded by rose gardens that were the envy of every gardening club in 3 counties. Martha had been friends with Michael's mother, had baked cookies for his 10th birthday party, the last one before his father disappeared. Michael pulled up to the curb behind 2 other patrol cars, their red and blue lights painting the fog-shrouded street in alternating colors. Officer Jenny Martinez met him at the gate, her usually calm demeanor rattled. "Michael, this is weird, really weird." "What kind of weird?" Michael asked, but his attention was divided. In the back seat, Ranger had begun to whine, not the anxious whine of a nervous dog, but something deeper, more purposeful, recognition. "Nothing's missing," Jenny said, consulting her notepad. "Mrs. Campbell says someone broke in through the back door, went straight to her late husband's study, tore it apart looking for something specific. But get this, whoever it was knew exactly where to look. Went right to the locked filing cabinet, bypassed all the obvious valuables." Michael's mouth went dry. "Did they find what they were looking for?" "That's what's really strange, Mrs. Campbell says the only thing missing is a box of old police files from the 1990s, stuff her husband kept when he retired from the force." Robert Campbell had been Michael's father's partner for 8 years before Thomas Anderson became chief. If someone was looking for those files now, 30 years later, it could only mean one thing. Someone was trying to bury the past or resurrect it. Emma's voice drifted from the patrol car. "It's okay, Ranger. We're just helping someone. Daddy always helps people." But when Michael turned to look, the German Shepherd was no longer sitting calmly. He was standing rigid, hackles raised, staring at Martha Campbell's house with the focused intensity of a predator. "Jenny, take Emma to get ice cream at Murphy's," Michael said suddenly. "Keep her there until I call you." "Michael, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." He had seen a ghost, several of them. His father's face and Ranger's amber eyes, his father's secrets creeping out of their carefully sealed graves, the weight of questions he'd spent 3 decades trying not to ask. "Just do it," he said, opening the car door. "And Jenny, if anything happens to me, call the state police. Tell them to look into the Anderson files from 1994. Ranger bounded out of the car before Michael could grab his leash, moving with a purpose that contradicted his scarred and battered appearance. The dog headed straight for the back of Martha's house, nose to the ground, following an invisible trail that made perfect sense to him. Michael found Martha Campbell sitting in her kitchen, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her wrinkled hands. At 82, she was still sharp as a tack, but tonight She looked every one of her years. Her silver hair was mussed, and her usually immaculate house dress was wrinkled. "Martha," Michael said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me about the files." Her pale blue eyes met his, and he saw recognition there. Not just of him, but of the moment they both knew had been coming for 3 decades. "Your father was a good man, Michael. Whatever else you hear, remember that first." "What files were stolen?" Martha's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup. "The investigation files. The ones about the dog-fighting ring that was operating out of the old warehouses down by the docks. Your father was building a case, getting close to the truth about who was running it, and then he disappeared." "He didn't disappear, honey." Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. "He was murdered, and I've been carrying that secret for 30 years. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Outside, he could hear Ranger barking, not the playful bark of a pet, but the sharp, authoritative bark of a working dog who had found something important. Martha stood on shaking legs and walked to the window overlooking her back garden. "Robert tried to tell you when you came back to town, but he died before he could work up the courage. Those files contain everything: photographs, witness statements, financial records. Your father had figured out that the dog-fighting ring was just the surface. Underneath it was something bigger: human trafficking, money laundering. And it went all the way to the top of this town." Michael joined her at the window. In the garden below, Ranger was digging frantically beside Martha's prize-winning rose bush, dirt flying in all directions. "What's he found?" "What your father buried the night before he died," Martha said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "The evidence that would have brought down some very powerful people. Evidence someone killed him to keep buried." As if summoned by her words, Ranger's barking intensified. He had unearthed something, a metal box, corroded by years underground but still intact. And standing at the edge of Martha's garden, barely visible in the gathering fog, was a figure Michael recognized with a chill of terror. Harold Brewster hadn't left town at all. He had been waiting, watching, making sure the dog would lead them to exactly this moment. The homeless veteran stepped into the light, and Michael saw that he wasn't holding an empty bottle or a cardboard sign anymore. He was holding a gun. Harold Brewster stepped into the circle of porch light, his military-issue boots crunching on the gravel path. The gun in his weathered hands wasn't the shaky grip of a desperate addict. It was the steady hold of someone who knew exactly how to use it. His army jacket hung open, revealing a faded tattoo on his chest, a German shepherd's head surrounded by the words, "K9 Handler, 82nd Airborne." "Step away from the box, officer," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And call your dog off." Michael raised his hand slowly, his mind racing through tactical options while his heart hammered against his ribs. Through the kitchen window behind him, he could see Martha Campbell reaching for the phone with trembling fingers. In the garden, Ranger had gone silent, crouched beside the unearthed metal box like a guardian over ancient treasure. "Harold," Michael said carefully, "you don't want to do this. Whatever's in that box, whatever happened to my father, shooting me won't solve it." A bitter laugh escaped Harold's throat. "Your father." He shook his head, never taking his eyes off Michael. "You think Thomas Anderson was some kind of hero, don't you? Some noble cop who died fighting the good fight? I think he was murdered for trying to expose corruption in this town." "He was murdered, all right." Harold's voice cracked like old leather, "but not for the reasons you think." Behind the house, car doors slammed. Michael recognized the voices of his fellow officers, but they were still too far away, still unaware of the armed standoff unfolding in Martha Campbell's rose garden. He needed to keep Harold talking, needed to buy time for backup to arrive. "Tell me what really happened," Michael said, taking a half-step closer. "You knew my father. You know what's in that box." Harold's grip tightened on the gun. "I didn't just know your father, Anderson. I worked for him. We all did. Me, Campbell, half the force. Your precious daddy wasn't investigating the dogfighting ring. He was running it." The words hit Michael like physical blows, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. "I don't believe you." "Believe this," Harold snarled, gesturing toward Ranger with the barrel of his gun. "That dog was your father's personal enforcer, trained to attack on command, trained to kill." "I should know. I'm the one who trained him." Michael's world tilted sideways. The German shepherd beside the rosebush lifted his head, amber eyes reflecting the porch light, and for a moment Michael saw not the gentle companion Emma had fallen in love with, but something darker, something dangerous. "The dog fighting was just a cover," Harold continued, his voice gaining momentum like a man finally unburdening himself of 30 years of guilt. "Dogs were easy to transport, easy to explain if anyone asked questions, but what we were really moving was drugs. Cocaine from Mexico, heroin from Afghanistan. I had the military connections, your father had the badge, and together we built an empire." "Then why is he dead?" Michael asked, his voice barely steady. "If you were partners, why kill him?" Harold's laugh was hollow. "Because Thomas Anderson grew a conscience, started talking about getting out, about going to the feds, said he couldn't look at you anymore without hating himself." His eyes narrowed. "So we made sure he couldn't talk to anyone, ever again." The metal box beside Ranger gleamed in the moonlight, 30 years of secrets waiting to be revealed. Michael could hear footsteps approaching through the fog, his backup finally closing in. But Harold heard them too, and his finger moved to the trigger. "That box contains everything," Harold said desperately. "Photos, financial records, names of everyone involved. Your father was going to use it to buy his way into witness protection." Instead, it became his death warrant. "Who else?" Michael demanded. "Who else was involved?" "Half the town council, the mayor, 3 state judges." Harold's voice cracked. "People you've probably shaken hands with at church, Anderson? People who've been living clean lives for 30 years while I rotted in gutters and VA hospitals, carrying their secrets." Through the kitchen window, Michael saw Martha Campbell speaking urgently into the phone. Her words were muffled by the glass, but her gestures were clear. She was directing the approaching officers around to the back of the house. Smart woman. She'd survived 82 years by knowing when to stay quiet and when to act. "Why bring the dog back?" Michael asked. "Why now?" Harold's eyes found Ranger, and something in his expression softened. "Because I'm dying. Liver cancer. 6 months, maybe less. And that dog," he swallowed hard, "that dog never forgot what your father did to him. Never forgot the commands, never forgot the training. But he also never forgot the kindness." "What kindness?" "Your father's last night alive. He came to the warehouse where we kept the dogs, and he spent 2 hours just sitting with this one, telling him he was sorry that none of it was the dog's fault." Harold's voice broke. "Your father died because he was trying to save all of them, the dogs, the town, himself. And this one remembers." As if responding to his name, Ranger stood slowly, his massive frame silhouetted against the rose bush. But instead of the aggressive posture Michael expected from a trained killer, the dog's tail wagged once, tentatively, as if asking permission to hope. "He led me to you," Harold continued. "I've been living rough for 20 years, and this dog tracked me down 3 months ago. Came right up to my camp like he was reporting for duty. And I realized he was giving me a chance to make things right." The sound of footsteps in the gravel grew louder. Officer Martinez's voice called through the fog. "Michael, you okay back there?" Harold's grip on the gun wavered. "I could have sold him to the fighting rings, could have made serious money, but I couldn't." He looked at Ranger, then back at Michael. He deserves better than what we made him. Deserves a family that won't use him as a weapon. Put the gun down, Harold, Michael said gently. Help us make this right. For a moment, the old veteran's shoulders sagged as if the weight of 3 decades was finally too much to bear. Then his spine straightened, and Michael recognized the posture of a soldier making his final stand. Can't do that, Anderson. Too many people still alive who'd kill to keep this quiet. Too many secrets still buried. He raised the gun, but not toward Michael. But I can make sure the truth finally comes out. The shot cracked through the foggy night like thunder, and Harold Brewster crumpled to the ground beside Martha Campbell's prize roses. Ranger barked once, a sharp, mournful sound, then padded over to the fallen man and lay down beside him, keeping vigil as approaching flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Officer Martinez appeared first, weapon drawn, followed by 2 other officers whose names Michael couldn't remember through the ringing in his ears. "Michael! Jesus, what happened?" Michael stared down at Harold's body, the gun still smoking in the dead man's hand. Suicide. The final act of a man who couldn't live with his guilt anymore. But beside the body, the metal box sat open, its contents scattered across the turned earth like seeds waiting to sprout into terrible truth. "Call the state police," Michael said quietly, "and call the FBI. We're going to need a lot more help than Millbrook can provide." As the officers secured the scene and Martha Campbell gave her statement in shaking whispers, Michael knelt beside Ranger. The German shepherd looked up at him with those amber eyes that had started this whole nightmare. And Michael saw not a killer, but a survivor. A dog who had been used as a weapon, but had chosen to become a guardian instead. "It's okay, boy," Michael whispered, his hand finding the soft fur behind Ranger's ears. "We're going to figure this out together." But even as he spoke the words, Michael knew that the contents of that box would change everything. Not just for him, not just for Emma, but for the entire town of Millbrook. 30 years of carefully buried secrets were about to claw their way back to the surface, and some of those secrets had teeth. The FBI arrived at dawn, their black SUVs cutting through the morning fog like sharks through gray water. Special Agent Sarah Chen stepped out of the lead vehicle, her sharp suit and calculating eyes surveying Martha Campbell's rose garden with the methodical precision of someone who had seen too many crime scenes. Behind her, a team of federal investigators began cordoning off the area with yellow tape, transforming the peaceful cottage into a fortress of secrets. Michael hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting in the Millbrook Police Department's break room, staring at photocopies of the documents from his father's buried box while Ranger lay at his feet, occasionally whimpering in his sleep. The contents were worse than Harold's confession had suggested. Bank records showing regular deposits from shell companies, photographs of prominent citizens at clandestine meetings, shipping manifests for livestock that arrived in sealed containers at the harbor. Emma was still at Jenny Martinez's house, blissfully unaware that her new dog had been trained as an attack weapon, that her grandfather had been a criminal, that the father she adored was about to become the center of the biggest scandal in Millbrook's history. Michael had called twice to check on her, and each time Jenny's voice had been carefully neutral. Word was spreading. In a town of 8,000 people, secrets had a half-life measured in hours. Agent Chen settled into the chair across from Michael, her laptop open, recording device positioned between them. "Officer Anderson, I need you to understand the gravity of what we're dealing with here. The documents in that box implicate 17 current and former public officials in a conspiracy spanning 3 decades, drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, and at least 4 murders." "4?" Michael's voice cracked. "Harold only mentioned my father. Robert Campbell didn't die of a heart attack 3 years ago," Chen said, consulting her notes. Preliminary examination of his medical record suggests poison, slow-acting, designed to look like natural causes. Someone was tying up loose ends. The words hit Michael like physical blows. Bob Campbell had been like an uncle to him, had taught him to fish, had been one of the few people willing to talk about his father after the disappearance. Who else? Judge Patricia Morrison in 2018. Apparent suicide, but the timing was suspicious. She'd just received a subpoena to testify in a federal money laundering case. And Detective Luis Vasquez in Sacramento last year officially ruled a robbery gone wrong, but Vasquez had been asking questions about old cases from Millbrook. Michael's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. 3 decades of violence, of careful murders disguised as accidents and suicides. His father hadn't just stumbled onto a criminal conspiracy. He'd been part of one that was still active, still killing to protect itself. Agent Chen leaned forward. "The good news is that dog of yours has given us the break we needed. Ranger, that is his name, correct? Appears to have been specifically trained to recognize certain individuals. We'd like to use him to identify surviving members of the conspiracy." "Absolutely not." Michael's response was immediate and firm. "That dog has been through enough. He's not a weapon anymore. He's my daughter's pet. Officer Anderson, with respect, that animal is evidence in multiple federal crimes. His training, his responses, his ability to identify suspects, all of that could be crucial to our investigation." Michael looked down at Ranger, who was watching the conversation with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes. The dog had positioned himself between Michael and Agent Chen, not aggressively but protectively. Even now, after everything Harold had revealed, Ranger's instinct was to guard rather than attack. "What kind of training are we talking about?" Michael asked reluctantly. Agent Chen opened a file folder, revealing photographs that made Michael's stomach turn. Dogs attacking on command. Dogs standing over bloodied victims. Dogs that had been turned into living weapons through systematic brutality. "Your father's operation was sophisticated. The dogs weren't just used for fighting, they were used for enforcement, debt collection, intimidation, and when intimidation wasn't enough," she didn't need to finish the sentence. "But Ranger's different," Michael said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "He saved Emma yesterday, protected her from another dog. If he was trained to be vicious, why would he?" "Because your father tried to deprogram him." Agent Chen slid another document across the table. "These are veterinary records from Dr. Elizabeth Hayes. She treated several dogs for the Anderson operation in the 1990s. According to her notes, your father brought this particular German Shepherd in repeatedly, not for injuries from fighting, but for what she described as behavioral rehabilitation therapy. Your father was trying to undo the damage." Michael stared at the faded veterinary records, his father's signature authorizing treatment after treatment. He was trying to save him, which is probably why both of them ended up dead. Agent Chen's voice softened slightly. "Your father wasn't just building a case against the conspiracy, Anderson. He was trying to rescue the dogs, find them good homes. That made him a liability to people who had invested millions in the operation." The break room door opened, and Officer Martinez entered with a troubled expression. "Michael, we need to talk. There's been an incident at the elementary school." Michael's blood turned to ice. "Emma? She's fine, but—" Jenny glanced at Agent Chen uncertainly. "Some parents are demanding she be removed from school. Word's gotten out about Ranger's history, about what Harold said. They're saying it's not safe for their children to be around a trained attack dog." "That's ridiculous," Michael snapped. But even as he said it, he understood their fear. If someone had told him yesterday that a child was bringing a former fighting dog to school, he would have had the same concerns. Agent Chen stood, closing her laptop with a decisive click. "This is exactly why we need to resolve this quickly. The longer this investigation drags on, the more your family becomes a target, not just from the remaining conspirators, but from the community. Through the break room window, Michael could see protesters beginning to gather on the front steps of the police station. Someone had made signs. "Killer dogs out of Millbrook" and "Protect our children, Mrs." Eleanor Whitman from the PTA stood at the front of the group, her voice carrying through the glass as she organized the crowd. "There's something else," Jenny said quietly. "Dr. Hayes called this morning. She wants to examine Ranger, says there are things about his training that we need to understand before this goes any further." Michael looked down at the German Shepherd, who had begun to pace restlessly near the window. The dog's ears were pinned back, his tail low, classic signs of stress. Ranger could sense the tension, the growing hostility outside. He was trapped between his violent past and an uncertain future, just like Michael. "What kind of things?" Michael asked. She wouldn't say over the phone, but she sounded scared. Michael, really scared. Agent Chen gathered her files. "I'm recommending protective custody for you and your daughter. The people behind this conspiracy have killed to keep their secrets before. They won't hesitate to do it again." "I'm not running," Michael said firmly. "This is my town, my home, Emma's home. We're not being driven out by people who've been living lies for 30 years. "Then you're putting your daughter at risk." "I'm protecting her by finishing what my father started." Michael stood, his decision crystallizing. "But I want guarantees. Full immunity for anything my father might have done. Protection for Emma if something happens to me. And Ranger stays with us, no matter what your investigation uncovers." Agent Chen studied him for a long moment. "You realize that dog might be the key to identifying everyone involved in this conspiracy. His reactions, his recognition patterns. They could lead us to people who've been hiding in plain sight for decades. Then we do it on my terms, in my town, with my dog." Outside, the crowd of protesters was growing larger. Michael could see familiar faces, people who had smiled and waved at Emma just days ago, who had thanked him for his service to the community. Fear had a way of transforming neighbors into enemies, turning a peaceful town into a battleground. Ranger moved to the window, his nose pressed against the glass. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he watched the crowd, but it wasn't the aggressive growl of an attack dog. It was the protective growl of a guardian who sensed threats to his pack. Whatever his father had done to him, whatever Harold had trained him to be, Ranger had chosen his own path. "Dr. Hayes is waiting at her clinic," Jenny said. "She says there are things about Ranger's training that could change everything. But Michael, she also says there are people in town who will do anything to keep those secrets buried." Michael clipped Ranger's leash to his collar, the leather worn smooth by Harold's desperate hands. "Then it's time to dig them up." Dr. Elizabeth Hayes's veterinary clinic sat at the edge of Millbrook's historic district, a converted Victorian mansion that had served the town's animals for over 40 years. The morning fog clung to the wraparound porch like desperate fingers, and the protesters' chants from downtown carried on the salt breeze. As Michael approached the front door with Ranger at his side, he noticed the clinic's windows were covered with newspapers, blocking the view from outside. Dr. Hayes answered the door before Michael could knock. At 73, she was still sharp-eyed and steady-handed, her silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for decades. But today, her face carried the weight of someone who had carried terrible secrets too long. "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was wondering when you'd finally bring him to me." Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and old memories. Ranger moved through the familiar space with cautious recognition, his nose twitching at scents that triggered fragments of the past. He paused at the examination room door, whimpering softly. "He remembers," Dr. Hayes said, watching the dog's reaction. They always remember the places where they felt safe. Agent Chen had followed them in her unmarked sedan, and now she stood near the reception desk, her recorder ready. Dr. Hayes, we need to understand exactly what kind of training this dog received. The elderly veterinarian gestured for them to follow her into the back office, away from the examination rooms. The walls were lined with files dating back decades, and Michael noticed that several cabinets bore new locks, the kind installed recently in a hurry. "Your father brought him to me when he was just a puppy," Dr. Hayes began, settling into her desk chair with a heavy sigh. "Adorable little thing, all ears and paws. Thomas said he was going to be a police dog, asked me to give him all his shots, start his health records. I thought it was wonderful. Thomas finally getting involved in the K9 program." She pulled out a thick file folder, its edges yellowed with age. "But the dogs that came after weren't police dogs. They were fighters, bred for aggression, trained to attack on command. And this one—" She looked at Ranger with eyes full of regret. "This one was being groomed to be something worse." "Worse how?" Michael asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Hayes opened the file, revealing photographs that made Agent Chen inhale sharply. Images of Ranger as a young dog, sleek and powerful, standing over what appeared to be a human-shaped training dummy. But these weren't ordinary attack dog exercises. The dummy was positioned as if cowering, begging. "Execution training," Agent Chen said quietly. "They were teaching him to kill on command." "Not just kill, Doctor," Hayes corrected, her voice trembling. "They were teaching him to terrorize first, to make people suffer before they died. I've seen military and police dogs, Michael. This was something else entirely." Michael felt sick. The gentle dog who had comforted Emma, who had positioned himself protectively between her and danger, this same animal had been systematically trained to torture and murder human beings. "But your father started bringing him for different sessions," Dr. Hayes continued. "Behavioral modification, he called it, trying to undo the damage. He'd spend hours here, working with Ranger, teaching him to be gentle, to protect instead of attack." She pulled out another set of photos, and Michael's breath caught. His father, younger than Michael was now, sitting on the clinic floor with Ranger's head in his lap. The dog's eyes were closed, his expression peaceful. In another photo, Thomas Anderson was hand-feeding the German Shepherd treats, his face showing a tenderness Michael barely remembered. "He was trying to save him," Dr. Hayes whispered. "All of them. The dogs were victims too, you see. Turned into weapons against their nature." Agent Chen leaned forward. "Dr. Hayes, we need you to be specific about Ranger's current capabilities. Is he still dangerous?" The veterinarian was quiet for a long moment, studying Ranger, who had settled beside Michael's chair. "That depends on what you consider dangerous. The attack commands are still there, buried deep in his conditioning. Under extreme stress, facing a direct threat to someone he's bonded with—" She trailed off. "He could revert," Michael said. It wasn't a question. "The training never really goes away. It's like muscle memory. But Michael, your father spent 2 years teaching him to choose." Every session, every visit, was about giving this dog the ability to make moral decisions, to overcome his conditioning through loyalty and love. Through the office window, Michael could see the protesters had followed them from downtown. Mrs. Whitman stood at the front of the group, her voice carrying through the glass. "That killer dog has no place in our community. Our children aren't safe." Ranger's ears flattened at the sound of the angry voices. He moved closer to Michael, pressing against his legs, not hiding, but positioning himself to defend if necessary. Dr. Hayes noticed the reaction. "He's reading the emotional temperature of the situation. That's not attack behavior. That's protection behavior. Your father succeeded, Michael. He turned a weapon into a guardian. But the people out there don't know that, Agent Chen pointed out. And frankly, neither do we. If this dog was trained to kill, how do we guarantee he won't? You don't, Dr. Hayes said bluntly. Just like you can't guarantee that any human won't snap under pressure. But I can tell you this, in all the years I treated him, through all the abuse he suffered, Ranger never once showed unprovoked aggression, never attacked anyone who wasn't threatening him or someone he was protecting. Michael's radio crackled to life. Officer Martinez's voice was tense. Michael, we have a situation at the elementary school. Parents are demanding to search the building for any traces of the dog. Principal Morrison is requesting immediate assistance. Agent Chen stood abruptly. This is escalating too quickly. We need to get your daughter into protective custody before... Her words were cut off by the sound of breaking glass. Through the office window, Michael saw that someone had thrown a rock at the clinic's front door. The protesters were no longer content to simply chant, they were advancing on the building. Back door, Dr. Hayes said urgently. My car is in the alley. Get him out of here before they do something stupid. But as they moved toward the rear exit, Ranger suddenly stiffened, his head turning toward the front of the building. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not the protective growl Michael had heard before, but something deeper, more primal. Recognition. What is it, boy? Michael asked. But even as the words left his mouth, he heard footsteps on the clinic's front porch. Heavy boots. Deliberate. Familiar. Through the office doorway, Michael could see a figure silhouetted in the broken glass of the front door. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of tactical vest that suggested law enforcement. But something about the man's posture, the way he moved through the building, set off every alarm bell in Michael's head. Ranger's growl intensified, and his hackles rose along his spine. The dog's entire body language had changed, from protective guardian to something Michael had never seen before. Something that remembered being a weapon. Agent Chen drew her sidearm, gesturing for Michael and Dr. Hayes to stay back. Federal agent, she called out. Identify yourself. The figure in the doorway laughed, and the sound made Michael's blood run cold. Hello, Ranger, the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience. I've been looking for you for a very long time. Ranger's response was immediate and terrifying. The dog dropped into a crouch, every muscle coiled for attack, his lips pulled back to reveal fangs that seemed impossibly large in the clinic's dim light. But he didn't attack. Instead, he looked back at Michael with eyes full of anguish, as if asking for permission to become the monster he had been trained to be. Easy, boy, Michael whispered, his hand moving slowly to his service weapon. You don't have to do this. The figure stepped fully into the light, and Michael's world shattered. Standing in the doorway of Dr. Hayes's clinic, very much alive and wearing the badge of a federal marshal, was his father, Thomas Anderson. 30 years older, scarred by time and guilt, but unmistakably the man who had disappeared when Michael was 10 years old. Hello, son, Thomas Anderson said quietly. I think it's time we talked. The world tilted sideways, and Michael felt as though he were falling through 30 years of carefully constructed reality. The man standing in the doorway wasn't a ghost or a hallucination. He was flesh and blood, weathered by decades, but unmistakably Thomas Anderson. The father who had disappeared when Michael was 10, leaving behind only questions, and a mother who never stopped waiting for his return. You're dead, Michael whispered, his service weapon half drawn but forgotten in his trembling hand. I saw your funeral. I threw dirt on your coffin. Thomas Anderson stepped fully into the clinic, his movements careful and deliberate. The federal marshal's badge gleamed on his chest, but his eyes were fixed on Ranger, who remained crouched in attack position, torn between 3 decades of conflicting training. The funeral was for someone else, a John Doe pulled from the harbor, burned beyond recognition. Your mother needed closure, and I needed everyone to believe I was gone. Agent Chen kept her weapon trained on Thomas, her voice sharp with authority. Federal Marshal Thomas Anderson died in 1994. I've seen the death certificate, the autopsy reports. Who are you really? I am Thomas Anderson, he replied quietly. And I've been working undercover for the U.S. Marshal Service for 33 years. The dogfighting ring, the drug trafficking, the murders, all of it was part of a deep cover operation to infiltrate one of the largest criminal organizations on the West Coast. Dr. Hayes sank into her chair, her face pale as old parchment. My God, she whispered. All these years I thought you were dead. I thought they killed you for trying to get out. They tried, Thomas said, rolling up his left sleeve to reveal a network of old scars. Harold Brewster nearly succeeded. Put 3 bullets in me down by the docks, left me for dead. But the marshals had been expecting something like that. They pulled me out of the water, gave me a new identity, let everyone believe I was gone. Michael's mind reeled. But why? Why let us think you were dead? Why abandon your family? The pain that crossed Thomas Anderson's face was genuine and devastating, because the operation was bigger than just Millbrook. We weren't just dealing with local corruption. This was organized crime with tentacles reaching into state government, federal agencies, international trafficking networks. If I had stayed, if I had tried to maintain any contact with you or your mother, they would have killed you both. So you chose the job over your family, Michael said, his voice bitter with 30 years of accumulated rage. I chose to sacrifice my family to save hundreds of others, Thomas replied, his voice breaking. Every month I stayed under, every year I remained dead to you. We rescued more victims, shut down more operations, saved more lives. But not a day passed that I didn't hate myself for what I was putting you through. Ranger's growl deepened, and the dog's amber eyes flicked between Thomas and Michael, as if trying to decide which man represented the greater threat. The conditioning was still there, the trained responses to authority, the ingrained patterns of violence. But so was the bond he had formed with Michael and Emma. The dog remembers me, Thomas said, his gaze finally meeting Michael's. I spent 2 years trying to undo the damage Harold's training had done to him. He was supposed to be my way into the inner circle, a weapon that would prove my loyalty to the organization. Instead, he became my reminder of what I was fighting against. Agent Chen lowered her weapon slightly, but didn't holster it. If you're really a federal marshal, why didn't you identify yourself when the investigation started? Why let your son go through this blind? Because the operation isn't over. Thomas's voice hardened. Harold's death was supposed to end it, but there are still players in the game. People who've been living respectable lives for 3 decades while their money stayed dirty. The moment I surfaced, they'd scatter like roaches. Through the clinic windows, the crowd of protesters had grown larger and more agitated. Someone had brought a bullhorn, and a voice Michael didn't recognize was whipping them into a frenzy. That killer dog is still in there. How many of our children have to die before the police do their job? Dr. Hayes moved to the window, peering through the newspaper covering the glass. There are at least 50 people out there now. And Michael, some of them are carrying more than just signs. Michael joined her at the window and felt his blood turn to ice. Mixed in with the concerned parents and legitimate protesters were faces he recognized from wanted posters, men who had no business caring about children's safety unless they were being paid to care. This wasn't a spontaneous community uprising, it was orchestrated intimidation. They're here for the dog, Thomas said, reading the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had lived in the shadows for decades. Ranger is the only living witness to crimes that could put powerful people in federal prison for the rest of their lives. As long as he's alive, as long as he can identify faces and respond to specific commands, The conspiracy is vulnerable. What commands? Agent Chen demanded. Thomas hesitated, his eyes finding Ranger, who had begun to pace restlessly near the clinic's back door. He was trained to recognize and attack specific individuals on sight. Muscle memory that goes deeper than conscious thought. If any of the original conspirators are still alive, still active in the organization, he'll know them instantly. The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. That's why you're here. You're not here for me or Emma. You're here for him. You want to use him as bait. I want to end this, Thomas said firmly. For 33 years, I've watched good people die while criminals live in mansions built on blood money. Your mother died believing I was dead, believing I had abandoned my family for money and power. I can't bring her back, but I can make sure her sacrifice meant something. Outside, the bullhorn crackled again. We know you're in there, Anderson. Send out the dog and nobody gets hurt. Ranger's response was immediate and chilling. The German Shepherd's training overrode 3 decades of gentle rehabilitation, and he dropped into a combat stance that transformed him from family pet into living weapon. His lips pulled back to reveal fangs that seemed designed for tearing flesh, and the growl that rumbled from his chest carried the promise of violence. But instead of moving toward the threat, Ranger positioned himself between the door and Michael, his amber eyes locked on his adopted master's face. The dog was choosing, consciously and deliberately choosing, loyalty over conditioning, protection over aggression, love over training. He's asking for permission, Dr. Hayes whispered in amazement. After everything they did to him, he's still asking for permission to defend his family. Thomas Anderson stared at the dog he had tried to save 3 decades ago, and tears ran down his weathered cheeks. He's better than all of us, he said quietly. Better than the people who made him. Better than the people who used him. He chose to be good despite everything we taught him about being a monster. The front door of the clinic exploded inward, torn from its hinges by something that sounded like a battering ram. Men in tactical gear poured through the opening, weapons drawn, faces hidden behind masks. But these weren't police officers or federal agents. Their gear was mismatched, their movements undisciplined, hired muscle, not law enforcement. "Everyone down!" the lead figure shouted, his voice muffled by the mask, but carrying an authority that suggested military training. "We're here for the dog. Give us the animal and everyone walks away." Ranger's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. 30 years of behavioral modification vanished in the space of a heartbeat, replaced by the cold efficiency of a trained killer. The dog launched himself at the nearest intruder with a speed and precision that made Agent Chen gasp audibly. But even as his jaws closed around the man's weapon arm, Ranger's eyes never left Michael's face. The attack lasted less than 10 seconds. When it was over, 3 armed men lay unconscious or writhing on the clinic floor, their weapons scattered like broken toys. Ranger stood over them, not in the stance of a rabid animal, but in the disciplined position of a soldier awaiting orders. "Good boy," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Good boy." The German Shepherd's tail wagged once, a small gesture that contained multitudes of loyalty, forgiveness, and love. Then he padded back to Michael's side and sat, amber eyes alert but peaceful, ready to protect his family against whatever came next. Through the shattered doorway, the crowd of protesters had fallen silent. They had come expecting to face a vicious animal, a creature driven by bloodlust and violence. Instead, they had witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about good and evil, nature and nurture, the possibility of redemption. Thomas Anderson holstered his weapon and looked at his son with eyes full of pride and regret. "He chose you," he said simply. "After everything that was done to him, After all the reasons he had to hate and fear and lash out at the world, he chose to love your family instead. Just like you should have chosen us, Michael replied, but the anger in his voice was tempered now by understanding. Maybe, Thomas admitted, but I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make sure Emma grows up in a world where dogs like Ranger don't have to be weapons, where children don't have to lose their fathers to 30-year undercover operations. The sound of sirens filled the air, real police this time, and federal agents drawn by the reports of shots fired at the veterinary clinic, but Michael barely heard them. He was looking at Ranger, this extraordinary creature who had survived the worst that humans could inflict and had somehow found the strength to choose love over hatred, protection over revenge. "What happens now?" he asked. Thomas Anderson smiled for the first time since entering the clinic, and Michael caught a glimpse of the father he had lost 3 decades ago. "Now we finish what we started, all of us. Together." 3 months later, the morning sun cast golden light across the newly constructed dog park at the edge of Millbrook, its sign reading Ranger's Rest Memorial Park in elegant bronze letters. The dedication ceremony had drawn visitors from 3 counties, including a delegation of federal officials and the governor of California herself. But Michael Anderson stood apart from the crowd, watching his daughter Emma throw a tennis ball across the grass while Ranger bounded after it with the enthusiasm of a puppy, his limp barely noticeable now. The trials had concluded just 2 weeks earlier. 17 individuals convicted on federal racketeering charges, including 3 sitting judges, 2 mayors, and the former state attorney general. The sentences ranged from 15 years to life, and the seized assets had funded the largest victim compensation program in California history. Harold Brewster's confession, combined with the evidence from Thomas Anderson's buried box and Ranger's trained recognition responses, had dismantled a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for over 3 decades. Thomas Anderson approached slowly, his federal marshal's badge catching the sunlight. The reunion with his son had been awkward, painful, and ultimately healing in ways neither man had expected. 33 years of separation couldn't be erased overnight, but the shared mission of protecting Emma and honoring Ranger's sacrifice had given them common ground to rebuild upon. "The governor wants to present you with a commendation," Thomas said, settling onto the park bench beside Michael. "Something about exemplary service in the face of extraordinary circumstances." "I don't want any more attention," Michael replied, his eyes following Emma as she taught Ranger to weave between the agility course obstacles. "We've had enough spotlights for one lifetime." The media coverage had been relentless. CNN had run a week-long special titled The Dog Who Remembered. Netflix was already developing a documentary series. Publisher after publisher had offered book deals that would have set Emma up for life, but Michael had turned them all down. Some stories, he believed, were too personal to sell. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes emerged from the veterinary clinic that now occupied a corner of the memorial park, her daily rounds completed. At 73, she had found new purpose in treating the dozens of rescued animals that continued to arrive from dismantled fighting operations across the West Coast. The clinic operated on donations and federal grants, but more importantly, it operated with the kind of compassion that had once saved Ranger's soul. "How's our boy doing today?" she asked, watching as Ranger gently retrieved the tennis ball and dropped it at Emma's feet without being commanded. "Better than any of us deserve," Michael said. "Some nights I still can't believe he chose to protect us after everything that was done to him." Dr. Hayes sat heavily on the bench, her joints protesting the morning chill. "I've been treating animals for 45 years, Michael. Dogs don't forgive the way humans do. They don't make conscious decisions about mercy or revenge. But they do make choices about love. And that dog chose to love your family even when love had been beaten out of him by people who should have known better." Emma's laughter carried across the park as Ranger performed a perfect recall, racing back to her side when she called his name. The transformation in both of them had been remarkable. Emma had grown more confident, more compassionate, taking on the role of Ranger's primary caretaker, with a seriousness that sometimes made Michael forget she was only 8 years old. And Ranger, scarred, broken Ranger, had found peace in a way that defied everything the experts had said about trauma and recovery. Agent Sarah Chen appeared at the park entrance, her usual government sedan replaced by a personal vehicle. She had requested a transfer back to the field after the Millbrook case, citing her need to work on investigations that still had secrets to uncover. But she had promised to attend Ranger's ceremony, and she kept her promises. The last of the appeals were denied yesterday, she announced, approaching their bench. Marcus Webb got life without parole. The judge said anyone who could torture animals and murder witnesses to protect a criminal enterprise forfeited any claim to mercy. Marcus Webb. The revelation that he had been Emma's biological father had nearly destroyed Michael's fragile sense of family identity. But Emma, with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence, had made the situation clear. A daddy is someone who takes care of you and loves you. That man never did either of those things. You're my daddy, and Ranger is my dog, and that's the only family I need. What about the money? Thomas asked. The restitution payments? Going into Emma's college fund mostly, Agent Chen replied. The Victims' Compensation Board approved the allocation yesterday. Between the seized assets and the federal grants, she'll never have to worry about educational expenses. Michael shook his head. Blood money. I don't want her future built on that foundation. It's justice money, Dr. Hayes corrected gently. Those criminals stole 30 years from this community. Using their assets to give a child a better future, that's not corruption, that's redemption. Across the park, a small group of elderly veterans had arrived for the ceremony. They came every week now, drawn by Ranger's story and their own memories of war dogs who had saved their lives in distant jungles and desert foxholes. Ranger seemed to understand their particular brand of trauma, moving among them with a gentleness that brought grown men to tears. He should have been destroyed, said Frank Morrison, an 82-year-old Marine who had served 3 tours in Vietnam. That's what they would have done to him in my day, put down any dog that had been trained to kill. But look at him now. Look what love can do to a broken soul. The ceremony began at noon, with the governor reading a proclamation declaring October 15th as Animal Rescue Awareness Day throughout California. Martha Campbell, now fully recovered from her ordeal, presented Ranger with an honorary medal recognizing his service to the community. The German Shepherd accepted the attention with dignity, his amber eyes scanning the crowd not for threats, but for children who might need comfort, veterans who might need understanding, or families who might need protection. Emma took the microphone with the fearlessness of a child who had faced real monsters and emerged victorious. Her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. Ranger taught me that it doesn't matter what bad things happen to you. It doesn't matter if people try to make you mean or scary or angry. You can still choose to be good. You can still choose to love people and protect them and be their friend. The applause was thunderous, but Ranger remained calm at Emma's side, his training and temperament perfectly balanced. He had learned to distinguish between celebration and chaos, between joy and threat, between the crowds that meant harm and the communities that meant healing. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Michael found himself alone with his father and his daughter and the dog who had brought them all together. The afternoon sun painted everything golden, and for the first time in 33 years Thomas Anderson looked at peace. I need to go back, Thomas said quietly. There are other operations, other children who need protecting, other animals who need saving. The work isn't finished. Michael nodded, understanding flooding through him. But you'll visit every chance I get. Thomas knelt beside Emma, who was braiding dandelions into Ranger's fur. Take care of him for me, sweetheart. And remember, the best way to heal from hurt is to help someone else heal from theirs. Emma looked up with eyes that held more wisdom than any 8-year-old should possess. Will you be safe, Grandpa Thomas? I'll be as safe as I can be, doing the work that needs doing. As Thomas Anderson walked away, disappearing once again into a world of shadows and secrets, Michael felt the weight of generational healing settling around his shoulders. His father had chosen duty over family once, and it had cost them all dearly. But that sacrifice had also saved countless lives, dismantled a criminal empire, and ultimately brought them all home to each other. Dr. Hayes gathered her medical supplies, preparing to return to the clinic where a dozen rescued dogs were recovering from their own traumas. You know, she said, pausing at the bench, in all my years of practice, I've never seen an animal make the conscious choice to overcome their conditioning the way Ranger did. It's almost like he understood the moral dimensions of his situation. Maybe he did, Michael replied, watching as Ranger gently nosed a fallen butterfly back into the air, his killer's instincts replaced entirely by a guardian's compassion. Maybe that's what separates the good ones from the monsters, the ability to choose love even when the world has given you every reason to choose hatred. Agent Chen shook hands with each of them, her professional demeanor softened by something approaching friendship. If you ever change your mind about those book deals or documentary offers, remember that Ranger's story could inspire reforms in animal protection laws nationwide. Sometimes the greatest service is sharing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Michael and Emma remained in the park with Ranger, watching the sunset over Millbrook's harbor. The town looked the same as it had 3 months ago. Victorian houses painted in pastels, fishing boats bobbing in the marina, tourists wandering the cobblestone streets. But everything had changed. Secrets had been exposed, justice had been served, and healing had begun. "Daddy," Emma said, her small hand finding his, "are we going to be okay now?" Michael looked down at his daughter, then at Ranger, who was lying peacefully in the grass, his amber eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. The dog, who had been bred for violence, trained for killing, and abandoned to die, had instead chosen to become the foundation of their family's redemption. "Yeah, sweetheart," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay. We're going to be more than okay." Ranger's tail thumped once against the ground, a gentle rhythm that sounded like contentment, like forgiveness, like the heartbeat of a soul that had finally found its way home. And in that moment, surrounded by the golden light of a California evening and the unconditional love of a dog who had chosen grace over vengeance, Michael Anderson understood that some bonds transcend breeding, training, and even blood. They transcend everything except the conscious decision to love. Dear friends, like many of you, I understand the weight of carrying family secrets, the pain of broken relationships, and the fear that some wounds never heal. Michael Anderson's story reminds us that it's never too late for redemption. At 42, he discovered his father wasn't the criminal he'd believed, but a man who sacrificed everything to protect others. Sometimes the people we've spent decades resenting were carrying burdens we never knew about. Ranger, that scarred German shepherd, chose love over hatred despite years of abuse. If a dog can overcome such trauma and learn to trust again, perhaps we can too. Whether you're estranged from adult children, carrying guilt over past decisions, or feeling forgotten in your golden years, remember that every sunrise offers another chance to choose grace. Our scars don't define us. Our capacity to love despite them does. The families we build through kindness often matter more than the ones we inherit through blood. Michael found that the father he'd mourned for 30 years was actually a hero, and the dangerous dog everyone feared became his family's greatest blessing. Sometimes our deepest wounds hide our greatest strengths, waiting for the right moment to transform pain into purpose. What family relationship do you wish you could heal, and what small step could you take today to begin that journey? Have you ever discovered that someone you misjudged was actually protecting you in ways you didn't understand? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.